Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to you all. Thanks so much for joining us for another lesson from In the Word. If you're a Bible teacher yourself, we want you to know how grateful you are that you join us periodically for our lessons. We consider you a partner in adult Christian education. And if you're just a student of the Bible, we welcome you as a partner. That's what we are, students of the Bible, who get a chance to teach once in a while. Yeah. Dr. Roberts and I are glad to be together again.
Good to be here.
And we have 4 wonderful lessons here as we wrap up a series that's been entitled Honoring God. Mm-hmm. And here we get 4 lessons from the Gospels, some of the teachings and life of Jesus.
Emphasizing Jesus' teaching about true worship.
Yeah. So today we're in the temptation story of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew. Mm-hmm. And when I first saw that text, I wondered, what's that have to do with worship? But then I realized the climactic temptation is, who is he going to worship?
That's the ultimate issue.
Yeah, that is the ultimate issue. And in a way, that's the ultimate issue for us, too, in our lives, who stands as the object of our worship. So we have a good text today. Well, this is Matthew's version, and Matthew's gospel starts off with the genealogy, which has a very clear focus. There's no doubt about what he's trying to emphasize.
It's a definite Hebrew, Jewish emphasis with 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations, but emphasizing David and the descent of the genealogy through the kings of Judah.
Yeah, so the emphasis in the genealogy, well, there's several, but one main emphasis is that Jesus is the true king. He is the Messiah, the fulfillment of the promise that started with David. And so there's also an interesting Gentile emphasis in Matthew's genealogy. The 4 women who are mentioned there against all Jewish custom appear to be Gentiles. So Jesus is the true Messiah, the true king, but he also has come for the Gentiles as well as the Jews. So, big emphasis on Jesus' messiahship in the genealogy. Then we get the birth story, where it's emphasized that he is the son of David.
Right, and yet you also have this international emphasis with the Magi coming.
That's right. But they come looking for the King of the Jews, and the advisors to Herod the First know what they're looking for. They're looking for the Messiah, and they know that Bethlehem is the place where Micah had prophesied the birth of the Messiah. So leading up to this temptation story in chapter 4, we have a big emphasis on Jesus' identity as the Son of David, the true Messiah. And then in chapter 3, at the baptism story, his identity gets confirmed.
By God.
Yeah. As well as
John the Baptist, the prophet.
As well as the prophet.
Yeah.
So that's confirmed in his adulthood as he begins his ministry. Now, all of that lies behind this temptation story, and it makes it so important. These are not just personal temptations for Jesus to break his fast or eat too much carbs or something like that. Right. There's something way, way deeper going on here. These temptations are a direct challenge to Jesus' messianic agenda.
Right.
What has God sent him to do? And Satan is trying to undermine that at every turn.
And the propositions that Satan presents to him are not doubting his identity, but since you're the Son of God.
Right.
And then these temptations.
Yeah, they're not, oh, come on now, John the Baptist doesn't know what he's talking about. There's no way you can be the Son of God. No, he approaches it completely different. Okay, fine. Assuming you're the Son of God, here, isn't this the agenda that you want to follow? Isn't this the path? And so he doesn't question his identity, but he tempts him to a different fulfillment of that identity.
Right.
Well, that's what's going on here in these temptations. So Very important. Well, why don't you read the text for us, and we'll talk through it.
It's Matthew chapter 4, first 11 verses. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you're the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it's written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him.
Well, it's a beautiful account of the temptation. Mark's gospel just gives us 2 verses on the temptation.
It's just a summary.
He was driven out into the wilderness by the Spirit. He was tempted, and that was it.
That's it. Yeah.
And then Luke gives us a fuller version.
He does, and adds a little in the end, at the very end, saying that the devil departed until an opportune time.
Right, and that's important to remember. Matthew's text in verse 11 that you just read says, "Then the devil left him." But Luke reminds us that Jesus would have faced this very temptation, this basic temptation, to redefine his mission according to the desires of the Jews at the time, rather than the desire of his Father, God.
Yeah, it really isn't an issue questioning his identity, but it's the method of serving God and whether it really does what God wants or what the world wants.
Yeah. The other thing that Luke's account does is switch the second and third, the order.
Yeah.
But that's not too big a difference there. Well, the opening verses of the text, for one thing, remind us of the baptism and how closely the baptism is linked to the temptation, because the Spirit has descended upon Jesus at the baptism, and now the Spirit is leading him or driving him, according to Mark, into the wilderness. The other connection is the wilderness. John was baptizing in a pretty wild, rural area, remote area, and now Jesus is being led, driven even further into the wilderness. The wilderness of Judah is not dense woods.
It's not a jungle.
No, it's not a jungle. It's not the woods. We live in eastern Tennessee, where we're surrounded by mountains covered with thick woods, and it's not like that at all. No. The word actually, which is translated desert in some versions, the word actually means uninhabited area.
Yeah.
That's the main emphasis. So it doesn't mean overgrown with vegetation, and it certainly doesn't mean Sahara Desert kind of thing. It just means he's out there all on his own.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other emphasis of these opening verses is a stress on the humanity of Jesus. I think the true humanity. Don't you see some things there?
Definitely. That the fact that he was there the 40 days, 40 nights, he was hungry.
Yeah. Yeah, and Matthew says as much at the end of verse 2 there. And the very fact that he was capable of being tempted reminds us.
And Hebrews mentions that he's tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin.
Right. And so, in Hebrews chapter 4, he's trying to show that Jesus is like the great high priest of the Jews in his ability, in his humanness and his ability to be tempted, but unlike him and greater than him by his resistance to that temptation. So, connection to the baptism, emphasis on his humanity. Now, the tempter is called the devil here in verse 1. This is the first of 3 terms
Yes.
describing him.
You've got devil here, and then in verse 3, tempter, and in verse 10, Satan. The name Satan is used.
Yeah. Now, Satan is the one that we meet first in the Old Testament, right?
But only 3 times in the entire Old Testament.
That was a real shock to me when that was first pointed out.
Well, and it was amazing to me that the story in the garden doesn't ever mention Satan,
No.
just the serpent.
No, the word devil, Satan, tempter.
Right.
I mean, there is temptation, of course, but none of these terms
Right.
appear there. And then just elsewhere in the Old Testament, including the book of Job,
Job and Zechariah in First Chronicles, the end
Yeah.
of First Chronicles.
So, Satan there. And Satan has the idea of one who calls into question the loyalty of human beings before God. That's really what's going on in Job. He's not trying to get Job to run around committing sins. He's trying to get Job to, or he's questioning before God Job's true loyalty to God.
The term is the accuser, and the adversary.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what devil means as well, accuser. So we'll run into those 3 terms as we go. This 40-day and night fast, that number, you might wonder, who cares how long and why 40? That is very reminiscent of other important moments in the lives of God's covenant people.
It's a very typical time frame.
Yeah.
40 days, 40 years.
Right.
You've got 40 years in the wilderness.
The Israelites traveling toward the
coming out of
promised
Egypt.
land. Okay.
You've got Elijah struggling with 40 days, his time escaping the wrath of the king and queen.
Right.
You've got 40 Moses preparing for the 10 Commandments in 40 days.
Yeah. And then David reigned for 40 years.
40 years, yeah.
So there are a number of truly significant moments in the covenant history of God's relationship with the Israelite people that use this number 40.
And that's part of
less.
where Christians have used the 40 for 40 days of Lent.
Right.
In preparation.
Right. Yeah, so it's clearly a number that took on significance. And I think the mention of it here is to remind us of Elijah's personal struggle in the wilderness and Israel's struggle through the wilderness, where they were tempted constantly to try to do things their own way rather than God's way, and usually with disastrous effect.
Yeah.
So that's the 40. Well, the first of the 3 temptations begins in verse 3, and here's where the second term is used, the tempter, rather than devil, the accuser. And as you said, the word "if" there shouldn't be interpreted as meaning that Satan is questioning Jesus' identity. Yeah. There are two words for "if" in the Greek language, and this one implies at least a theoretical acceptance of the fact.
If you are, and you probably are.
Yeah, let's assume you are.
Yeah.
So this first one, tell these stones to become loaves of bread.
Yeah, the stones, we think of river rocks around here. The rounded stones look like a loaf of bread.
It would look like a little loaf of bread, sure, the kind that they would have baked in their ovens back then. Now, there is a connection here, of course, to Jesus' own personal physical hunger at this time. But it's very important to remember that there's something way bigger going on here. This temptation could have set Jesus off on a trajectory of accomplishing his messianic role simply by miraculous satisfaction of people's physical needs. And of course, Jesus was capable of doing that.
Right.
He was a healer.
And he fed the 5,000
and he
and
fed,
the 4,000.
Yes.
But the people clamored for more.
Yes, they
They
did.
wanted it on a regular basis.
And they misinterpreted his ability to meet their physical needs, because after the feeding of the 5,000, it says they wanted to make him king.
Yeah, John chapter 6.
Yeah. And clearly, you know, you could say, well, Jesus was the king of the Jews, but not in the sense that they wanted.
That's right.
They want a David to lead their army and destroy their enemies.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of why this is a temptation, and why it's a way bigger, deeper temptation than just Jesus wanting to satisfy his own
Something
hunger.
to eat.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So this really touches his messianic agenda. And the Gospel of Mark is so helpful here. We have 10 whole chapters of miracle stories where we see Jesus has the power to satisfy physical needs as well as spiritual needs like exorcisms, but healing after healing and feeding after feeding.
Right.
But then when we switch to the end of the story, we realize it's not his miracles that prove that he's the Messiah. It's his death on the cross. That's the moment.
The question all through the Gospel of Mark is, who is this?
Yeah.
And they're seeing him do wondrous things, but it's the centurion who says, this is the Son of God.
Right. Watching him die. So Jesus resists the temptation. Although he, out of compassion, he does meet people's physical needs, he resists the temptation to have that define his identity as Messiah.
Yeah.
Well,
And he answers with Scripture.
yeah.
Deuteronomy.
Yeah, okay. Every temptation is answered with a quotation, and every quotation is from Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
It
The
appears
second
to
law.
be one of Jesus' favorite Old Testament books.
Yeah.
He seems to.
It kind of summarizes all the law.
It
in the book of
does, yeah,
Deuteronomy.
in a beautiful way. Jesus seems to have been fond of Isaiah as well, but Deuteronomy was very popular in his mind. So here's this beautiful quote from Deuteronomy 8, humans shall not live on bread alone, but, by contrast, on every word that comes from the mouth of God.
And we're not speaking mouth of God as though God has a mouth physically, literally, like we do.
Right. God is spirit. And so this is what we call an anthropomorphism, where we talk about God using human language, knowing that God is not a human, or
It's
not
the best way to understand it.
Yeah,
but
not limited
yeah.
by our human form. Yeah, good. All right, well, the second temptation then begins in verse 5, and here we're back to the word devil or accuser after having tempter in verse 3. Took him to the holy city. Now, we have no doubt about what the holy city was, right?
The Jewish book to a Jewish people,
Yeah.
it's obviously Jerusalem.
It is, and it's interesting. This is one example of how we know that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, and probably even an audience right there in Palestine, because he doesn't bother to define
Right.
what the holy city is, but everybody knows
Yeah.
it's Jerusalem.
But the highest point of the temple.
Yeah, now when I was a child, I have to admit, I assumed the temple had steeples on it like Christian church buildings do today. So I was picturing Jesus tottering up on the point of a steeple. The temple had no steeple.
Right.
It did have walls around it. And archaeologists are of the opinion that what they would have considered the highest point of the temple was a place on the very southeast corner of the wall that surrounded the temple. It was at that point that the wall was very, very high, because the ground fell away as it went toward the southeast. So that would have been a precipitous drop if he had jumped
Over the
off
Kidron
there.
Valley.
Yes, kind of where the valley of Hinnom in the south meets the Kidron Valley on the east. Our viewers can look at a map of Jerusalem if they want to see where that would have been. The reason why that's important is that southeast corner was a place where at least 3 major roads merged. There was kind of a big intersection there, coming from the east and the south toward Jerusalem. And so if Jesus had jumped from that spot, it not only would have been a long fall it would have been an easily visible fall.
Spectacular.
Yeah, exactly.
To
It
people,
would have been
yeah.
seen by a lot of people. And I think that may be why that's helpful to know. Once again, we get the if, assuming you're the Son of God, throw yourself down.
But here the devil quotes scripture
Yeah,
from Psalm 91.
it's a longer quote even, too, isn't it? Although
Not
he
complete.
leaves some words out. Psalm 91:11 says, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. And Satan leaves that part
Yeah.
out. At any rate, he says, okay, I'll do you one better. I'll quote from Psalms here.
And he's saying, here's a promise of God, protection, it won't hurt you, jump.
And Jesus once again answers from Deuteronomy, chapter 6 this time. It's interesting what he chooses in resisting his own testing by Satan. He says it's inappropriate to put God to the test.
Right.
Yeah,
To demand that God rescue you.
yeah.
Yeah.
James, the New Testament book of James, makes it clear that God himself tempts no one.
Right.
And now Jesus is saying the kind of the flip side of that is that, and we shouldn't tempt God.
Right.
We shouldn't put
Test
God's
God.
will to the test.
Yeah.
All right, third temptation starts.
Into a high mountain. It
in
doesn't
verse
say
8.
what mountain. We don't know whether he actually physically went or envisioned,
in his mind's eye or
but
something.
it's all the kingdoms of the world.
Yeah. So here's a sight temptation. All the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, the NIV says, the word is the word for glory, the physical glory of political kingdoms.
And Satan says, all this I'll give you. And of course you question, how did he? Well, the prince of this world has control in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
But he is also a liar.
right. And we assume that, ultimately God has all things under control, even if Satan's control can be discussed. I think of the great, what I think is the theme verse of the book of Revelation, and the kingdoms of this world shall become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. So he resists the temptation to be the ruler, since it comes at the cost of bowing down to Satan. And here we come back to the worship theme, which is in the unit that we're talking about right now. And Jesus responds from Deuteronomy 6, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve only him.
Yeah. And Philippians 2 indicates that every knee will bow to Jesus, not because he demands power, but because he went to the cross.
Yeah,
And
right.
was resurrected.
That's in that beautiful hymn in Philippians 2, where it says he humbled himself, became obedient to death on the cross, and it's by virtue of that that every knee shall bow.
Yeah.
That's a great insight. Yeah, I like that. Before his third quote from Deuteronomy, we have these famous words, away from me, Satan.
Yeah.
Go away, Satan. And the haunting thing about those words is how similar they are to the words he spoke to somebody else.
Peter.
To his own.
When Peter was saying, don't talk about the cross, that's not going to happen to you.
Yeah.
Jesus said,
So people may wonder why he used that kind of language for Peter. It seems so harsh. But Peter, in a sense, is doing the same thing that Satan was doing here. And that is trying to shift Jesus away from his messianic agenda, which brought salvation by means of the cross, rather than salvation by means of
power,
victory, and spectacle and things like that. Yeah. So Jesus says to Peter, get away from behind me, Peter. You can't be my follower if you're not willing to follow me to the cross.
And the final verse of the passage here, the devil left him. Angels came and attended him. But as we mentioned, Luke says, devil left him until an opportune time. There were a lot more temptations that came.
I think the Garden of Gethsemane is an example of one. And who knows, while those Jewish religious leaders stand at the foot of the cross saying, we'll believe in you if you'll come down from the cross, That would have been a temptation.
Even on the cross, yeah.
Yeah.
And during his ministry, the opposition, the leaders of the nation were throwing all kinds of things against him. And his own followers were planning the kingdom.
Right.
Who's going to be in power? Who's going to be secretary of this and that?
Yeah. So everybody had an idea for what kind of Messiah Jesus was going to be, and he had to remain steadfast in following his Father's will. Well, in the few minutes that we have left, let's step back and look at these temptations, kind of the big picture, because we've got two important things going on here. One is reminding ourselves what kind of Messiah Jesus was resolved to be, but the second is these temptations kind of have an echo effect in our lives as well.
They really do. And people have said, oh, this is strange, turning rocks into bread and jumping off temples and so forth. But those may not be tempting to us, but with his power, his ability, these were the temptations he faced. But the ultimate thing is not the specifics of bread and jumping and so forth. It's the method that was going to be used to fulfill the will of God. And William Barclay talks about the three temptations in relation to some of the things that we face, and that some temptations come because of weakness and need. So we're looking at bread, we're vulnerable, we're looking for, we're fatigued, we're discouraged, we look for easy answers. Other temptations come on the basis of confidence and pride. You can jump and God will protect you, and sometimes we get into a situation of declaring what God must do because I'm faithful. This has to happen, and it's a temptation. And then there are temptations regarding hopes and aspirations. We want to win the world, and we'll do it whatever way it takes. The end justifies the means. So sometimes they fit our personal situation. But then you were talking about some other perspectives.
Yeah, another great spiritual writer, Henri Nouwen, looks at these, and he came up with this connection to our lives. The first is the temptation to be productive, to define our success as Christians on the basis of what we can make or produce, like the bread. And the second is the desire to be popular. If Christians were just more popular, look at me. And so we want to put on a spectacle and have more people come to our church. And then the third is the desire to plug into political power and hope that we can advance the kingdom by that means, all the kingdoms of the world. So at any rate, those are several ways to look at it. Another commentator said, the first is the temptation to be relevant, the second is the temptation to be remarkable, and the third is the temptation to exercise our rule over everything, control, authority.
The devil's sly, but faithfulness to God.
Jesus shows the way, doesn't he? And thank you so much for joining us. This has been interesting, and I think we've developed some insights not only into Jesus' messiahship, but into our own resolve to follow Jesus all the way. Hope you can join us again next time. We'll see you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.